When I was in Japan teaching EFL, there was one computer in the teacher's room. There were knife fights to use that computer in the teacher's room. Not everyone had one.
A knife?
Well, yeah.
Thank God.
Actually, I can tell a story about a knife in a teacher's lunchroom. I'll share that story in a second, I guess. But
That's called baiting the hook for the listener.
I
Yes.
like it.
yeah.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week, on Speaking of Language,
Sam and Angelika welcome John Graves, the newest team member at the Cornell University Language Resource Center. John talks about growing up in a bilingual household, considers how to apply his educational philosophies as the new instructional designer and project manager at the LRC, and shares some heart-pounding stories from his past teaching experiences.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelika Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Sam Lupowitz, the LRC's media manager. We have a very special guest on the podcast today.
Our LRC team has a new member. Woohoo!
Yay!
John Graves is the new instructional designer and project manager here, and we are excited to introduce him to the world.
Welcome to Speaking of Language, John.
And welcome to the LRC.
All right, sounds good. Welcome to you both, and thanks for having me.
So we want to hear all about you. What's your background specifically with languages, specifically with technology? What brought you to the LRC?
So growing up, my mother's Japanese. She's from southern Japan. And so when growing up in a household where two languages are being spoken was really my first exposure to, to the idea of a foreign language. Listening to my mother speak to my grandmother and grandfather on the phone and trying to understand exactly what they were talking about, and very often they would say my name and then laugh. They would say my name and laugh afterwards. So I was trying to understand, what was my mother telling my grandparents about what I was doing. So that's where I really became interested in trying to decode what was my family talking about, and then later on it became more sophisticated in trying to understand, what my cultural heritage was and background through language.
Sure.
So when I graduated from college, undergrad, my parents said, you got to find something to do because you're not going to live here forever. And they said, what about you go visit your sister in Japan? She's in the Navy over there. Why don't you go visit her and, try to find things out. And in the meantime, enjoy Japan and have fun there. And so we had a 3-month visa. She left on deployment on a U.S. Navy ship, and I was left alone in her apartment.
Oh, wow.
Not knowing how to speak Japanese. And eventually, after all the snacks were gone out of the cupboard, out of the cupboards in her house, I had to go outside. And so going outside was, okay, now I have to experience the culture and try to understand how to, apply for jobs and do those kinds of things. And so it was really survival Japanese at that point. And so
I love it.
After that, it was 6 years working in the public school system in Japan, standing in front of a classroom, in many cases 46-year-olds, 13-year-olds, teaching English as a foreign language, EFL, where I started to really start to understand like how my background informed my teaching. So that was really my first exposure to teaching. I think many teachers would say this. Many don't get formal training. They get thrown into a situation where they're in front of students, and then now they have to make it interesting, but they also have to make it engaging, and also have them learn something. Right? And so I go, wow, it's like the Holy Trinity. You want all three of those things to happen in this class today. And I'm sure many faculty can sympathize with this this point. After that, came back to the States. I went to the Middlebury program, intensive language program, and one of the rules was you can only speak Japanese for the whole time you're here. And I go, that's great, because that's exactly what I was doing for 6 years, being in Japan. So this is buying me time for me to have to fully assimilate back into American culture.
Gotcha.
So I did that, and that was a really interesting exposure to immersion learning.
Yeah.
U.S. style. At the Middlebury program, and it was interesting to see how they taught language in those programs. There's all these pieces of grammar that I never learned in Japanese that I only learned by exposure.
Sure.
That now I know I started to understand. Okay, these are the formal names for these. Genzai, kakoke, all these different terminologies for grammar in Japanese that I learned, and so I was working backwards, which I think is a common story for folks that independently learn a language, as they sometimes get immersed in the language and then they have to backtrack and then, this is the foundation of what that's why I was saying that.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like learning or acquiring your first language, right? I mean, you don't necessarily know what all the grammatical rules are. You just pick things up.
Right. And so that was really, and I see myself as a highly observant person. And so just observing what the native speakers do and understanding, why do they do that? Like, what's the distance between speakers?
Sure.
What's the tone like? So when I was a little kid, tone was an important thing, because when I heard a serious tone followed by laughter, I go, maybe they're talking about my grades. Maybe they're talking about how John's doing in public school. That sounds about right. C minus, ha ha ha. So that was.
You don't strike me as a C minus student. Just want to throw that out there.
It was a tough road to here. Let's put it to this chair right here. Academically speaking, I think the good thing about being at Cornell is you're surrounded by smart people, right? Which is smart, capable people, talented people. I could say the same thing for my time. I've only been here for a week at the LRC. It's great to be around that kind of atmosphere of, smart student workers, very engaged and intelligent, and very capable faculty, and then also the staff here. So for me, that's just been, that's made it very easy to kind of settle into things, and I'm excited about, being here.
That's a nice segue. Could you talk a little bit about what got you excited about working at the LRC?
So I was very involved in medicine, human medicine, veterinary medicine. I was involved in education where it was gross anatomy and cadavers and necropsy and autopsy, and those types of things were actually things that students did to learn how to perfect their craft. And while that was a very exciting experience, and I have a lot of great stories that I can share. Probably not in a podcast. They're pretty but
when Halloween rolls around next fall semester,
right? Oh yeah, there's plenty I could.
John's medicine corner.
There's a couple that are popping into my head that maybe I shouldn't. Yeah, I can't say. But then I started to realize over time that, foreign language learning has been such a foundation for my life, like going all the way back to childhood.
Sure.
To a point that it's very difficult to get that same passion for something. While medicine and your health and wellness and all those things are things that everyone should be concerned about and be passionate about, it never was the same. And so being around folks that want to talk about how can we learn languages better? What were your experiences learning language? Because it's interesting how faculty want to share their stories, how staff want to share their stories, but also how students want to share their stories about how easy or how difficult it is to learn a language. And I missed hearing those stories. So for me coming back, it felt like I came back to home because I'd really been around this my whole life. So it's just getting back into what I really was passionate about from the beginning, and I've taken the time to understand that that's kind of where I want to be right now. So
that's great. Well, and we're very excited to have you here. So you bring a lot of experience with instructional technology, educational technology, instructional design. Thinking about educational technologies in general, what suggestions or tips do you have for language learners specifically? How can technology help them in their pursuit of learning languages, learning about cultures?
Well, I think for me, because I really started learning language by myself, And I was also in an environment that is Japan, where technology is just everywhere. I was text messaging in Japanese. I was reading, websites in Japanese. Very much drawing on technology to immerse myself in the target culture. And so if learners can find those outlets, like whether it's a website or whether it's YouTube videos. Or even like podcasts online. So, for example, there's many podcasts that are online in Japanese in particular that talk about pop culture, anime, things of that nature. And it's amazing to me how much Netflix now shows anime, and that's actually how I keep up with my Japanese.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Which is probably not the greatest thing because there's many levels of discourse in a language, and anime is not always. Anyway, it does its thing and it's entertaining, but it's not every level of discourse in a language. So I think leveraging technology. I think the real tool for it is like review, like self-review, and being able to review in an environment where you feel safe. And in many cases, for me, it was a Starbucks in Tokyo.
Yeah.
It was at my house, places like that, because for some students, maybe they don't feel entirely, maybe they don't want to experiment in the classroom with the language, but then they go offline and practice at home, and they come back and they gain the confidence to try it in front of their peers.
Yeah.
And so I think technology in that regard has been, I wouldn't be a fluent or close to fluent speaker. And I know fluency is probably another topic for another podcast, right? Proficiency in those conversations. But that's where it helped me. And I think it can help, language learners with gaining their confidence and trying things out and, making mistakes and then trying something again, making mistakes, fixing, and then, coming back to the table and trying again, which is, that's going to be their career.
Yeah.
As a lifelong learner, no matter where they go with their language.
And what about educators? What are affordances of technology for learning and teaching?
I always wanted to say to educators, before technology was on the scene, there were things that you were doing well in the classroom without it.
Yep.
So, for example, when I was in Japan teaching EFL, there was one computer in the teacher's room, and there were knife fights to use that computer in the teacher's room. Not everyone had one. It was
a knife.
Thank God.
I could tell a story about. Actually, I can tell a story about a knife in a teacher's lunchroom.
Oh my!
In Japan, that was exciting. I'll share that story in a second, I guess. But
that's called baiting the hook for the listener.
So it was. It's interesting because I think many faculty go into the conversation about integrating technology into their teaching approach going, what are you saying? I don't teach well? Like, what are you saying? I don't do my job well? Why are you telling me to use this technology? And for me, that's not what I want to convey to a faculty member. What I want to say is just keep in mind what you do well already. And this is merely an enhancement on top of what you do well already. And if and this is a conversation about how we can integrate those things if needed. But for example, for me, for the longest time, I never knew that I wasn't taking like pictures and placing them within a Word document to create a handout. I was literally copying pages and burning down trees and taking scissors and then putting glue around them and then putting on a piece of blank paper and then copying them for 40 students. And then someone came up to me in the teacher's room and goes, there's something really cool called word processing and graphic design. And graphic design to them meant you can drag a photo that you onto a screen and place it there. And so for me, I think it was great for me to have the analog and then put the digital on top of that.
Yeah.
So in many ways, what educators are doing is the analog is what they do, how they teach in the classroom, what they do really well. The enhancement is in my case what happened with me, where the word processing and the graphics manipulation fell on top of this, paper and glue solution. So that would be my word of advice. Like, and also, if you set up a meeting with me, I'm pitching myself here, but if you set up a one-on-one meeting with me, it really is going to initially start as a conversation. I want to hear what you do first. Before I even approach the conversation about how technology can enhance what you do well already. Mm-hmm. My contact information will be on the site. You can set up a meeting with me, but that's really how I approach it as an ongoing conversation that I'll have with the faculty that I'm working with.
And I think this is something that has come up in previous episodes too. I just want to remind everybody that technology is not the goal, right? Technology is used to support what the ultimate goal of the faculty member is, or of the learning process. And I know that I've made that mistake in my early teaching days. There are all these cool tools, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I need to try this out for the sake of trying out the tool, and not really thinking about, well, what's the pedagogical implication? What do I want my students to be able to do?
Right.
I don't want to use this tool myself. I mean, there is no educational value in that, right?
I used to build lesson plans around a cool tool.
So did I.
And I go, oh, that's such a great tool.
Yep.
And then when I tried that, it ultimately,
Failed.
those lesson plans failed because it just became disjointed around the technology as opposed to being fronted by what are you trying to teach those students that day, and what are they going to leave the classroom? What skills are they leaving the classroom with? And then how's technology going to enhance that rather than... I've run into that. I still do it from time to time.
Well,
as we all do, but from time to time. But that's definitely a good point.
I want to hear about that knife.
Okay, good. I was hoping you would plow ahead.
So I
was ready.
So I had so there was a kendo instructor. He was also a phys ed teacher. So at the school where I was working, and he came in. And I was eating my bento box in the teacher's room, and he comes over and he says, "Johnson, I have something to show you." And I go, "What?" And he brings out I think it was a blade. I don't know how long the blade was, like maybe a foot long blade.
Wow.
It was his family's samurai sword, like the smaller of the two samurai swords that he brought out to show me. And then he said, "Give me a piece of paper." And I said, "What? You can give me a piece of paper." Like, I'm freaking out here because he's showing this knife to all the other teachers, and he takes the piece of paper and he drops it on the blade, and it cuts it in half in front of me. And so I went. So I think that was my first or second week at that school, and so I think he was sending a message that I own this school. You're the outsider coming in, and
Nice.
And so. I'm really glad that the onboarding at the LRC wasn't like that. Actually, it was very pleasant. It's a very pleasant experience here. But full disclosure, that was,
That's where the bar was set.
So I go, wow, this is really pleasant. No knives, no paper.
Oh, man.
But that was the story, yeah.
You know what's funny? At my previous institution, we ran summer camps for children. And one time in German camp, this little kid pulled out a knife of his boot in the middle of camp. And he thought that this was a great show and tell because this was a knife his German grandfather had and had gifted to him.
Oh, boy.
Wow.
And we had to deal with disgruntled parents, other parents of other children, where this 8-year-old is just randomly pulling out a knife of his boot in the middle of the day, wielding it around in summer camp. So that was fun. I think what we're learning here is do not bring knives into
Places
summer
of
camps
learning,
or offices,
Those aren't
teachers' lounges.
I had one of my my favorite English teachers growing up, I guess when I was in middle school, had a story. She was always handy, whenever she would help out with things like the school musical or do various things around school. And she always had a switchblade handy, which somehow she was able to get away with. No one ever asked Ms. Brock about the switchblade. But one time, I guess some students did, they said, "Ms. Brock, why do you carry that with you?" She said, "Oh, well, when I was first out of college and I was teaching in Baltimore public schools,
wow.
Inner city schools, and it was Halloween, and we were going to carve a jack-o'-lantern, And I realized they didn't have anything to carve it with. And the students said, "Oh, we'll help you, Ms. Brock." And they all pulled out their knives. So I made sure from that day forward that I always had one. So, yeah, she was a tough cookie.
When you said Baltimore, I understood immediately what that.
Like, oh, you were teaching in The Wire. Got it.
Oh, my goodness.
All right, well, nice, fun tangents. Before we sign off, what is your favorite word in a language you speak or have learned, are learning, want to learn? Please share with our listeners.
So in Japanese, it was gocha gocha, which is like, that's all mixed up. So when I started to speak Japanese, that was what a lot of folks said to me about my Japanese at first. So I knew the less that was said back to me, the closer I was getting to getting better at the language. So I hear it a lot less now, but when I first started, that was a painful word to hear.
You know, for a second, I thought you were going to say knife in Japanese.
Well, now they say knife. Katana, all these different words. It's just, there's so many loan words that are coming into Japanese every year. There's a lot going on there.
Well, John, thank you so much for speaking of language with us today, and welcome again to the LRC community.
Glad to be here, and thanks to you both.
Next week, we will speak with some foreign language and area studies fellows.
FLAS fellowships are funded by the U.S. Department of Education and help graduate and undergraduate students acquire high levels of competence in languages that are deemed critical to the national needs of the United States. They also help students to gain a fuller understanding of the areas, regions, or countries in which those languages are commonly used.
Hear from fellows from Cornell's South Asia program and Southeast Asia program, and get ready to submit your own application by March 4th. Until then,
Auf Wiederhören!
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu or look for Cornell LRC on Facebook and Twitter.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelika Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.